So in this video, I'm going to go through some of the theories that Elizabeth Lloyd criticizes in her book, The Case of the Female Orgasm, Bias in the Science of Evolution. If you haven't watched the other video for this week, I recommend you start there because I kind of set up the project and what she thinks would count as a good evolutionary explanation. Okay, so just going through some of the accounts that she pulls from the literature. There's a pretty famous one from Desmond Morris. So Desmond Morris suggests a pair bond account. So the orgasm has something to do with pair bonding. And pair bonding is a thing we see lots of primates doing. Humans seem to do it as well. He suggests that orgasm causes women to become attached to one particular male. And being attached to one particular male has the evolutionary consequence or the sort of fitness consequence of helping her to sort of secure her more resources and something like that. So the basic idea, orgasm helps cement the pair bond. Okay. Now, Lloyd points out on page 51, note, and this is a direct quote, note that Morris's account works only if there's a differential rate of female orgasm within and outside the pair bond. So, you know, it probably sounded sort of plausible to you when I said, look, the orgasm helps to secure the pair bond or helps to cement the pair bond. The orgasm is an emotional experience, and maybe it sort of helps to emotionally bond you to your partner. But Lloyd wants us to note that that's, you know, it sounds okay, but it only actually explains anything if there's if you're more likely to have an orgasm in a relationship than outside one. So in a pair bond rather than outside of a pair bond. And if you recall from the last video, contemporary studies of female orgasm doesn't seem to show that that's the case. Not only is Morris seen to assume a fact that hasn't been proven, actually the opposite has been proven. So they say, they looked at orgasm rates, and one of the things that there was practically zero correlation with was, quote, relationship length and status. So there doesn't seem to be a differential rate of orgasms in a relationship or out of it. There's just no correlation there. So that suggests that orgasms aren't playing the role of cementing the pair bond, or at least so Lloyd argues. Okay, so another one from Desmond Morris. Another criticism for Morris's view. For example, gibbons pair for life. They're strong pair bonders, but females don't have the orgasm reflex. So it doesn't seem to be crucial if it is a thing. No. Okay. Morris has another proposed explanation. It's perfectly valid to offer more than one explanation in evolutionary terms. There doesn't have to be just one story about why something contributes to fitness value. But Lloyd doesn't think this one works either. So another story that Desmond Morris tells us is that orgasm might induce women to stay still after intercourse, increasing the chances of conception. One of the problems with this that Lloyd points out is that women don't need to stop after just one orgasm. Women who have orgasms can be multi-orgasmic. What research does exist on this subject? So there has been some research on how women feel after orgasm, and the suggestion is that they tend to feel more active, not less. So men report after orgasm feeling sleepy on average. These are all like generalizations. Of course, there's individual differences, but on average, men report feeling sleepy and sedentary after an orgasm, and they're generally done after one, at least for a little while. Women report feeling enlivened and invigorated, and that suggests that this just doesn't fit with the facts. So Morris's suggestion is orgasm makes, on average, women more likely to sort of lie down, stay still, which would help with conception, and that just doesn't seem to fit the facts. That just doesn't seem to fit what we actually make observations about how women behave. On average, this doesn't seem to be true. So this is, if you recall, Lloyd's sort of minimal requirements on an evolutionary explanation. The very first one was it should fit the facts. Neither of Morris's stories seem to fit the facts. Okay, moving on. So Mate selection accounts. So maybe the orgasm has something to do with choosing your mate. Okay, so Allen and Lemon argue that female orgasm acts as a mechanism of mate selection. That is, there's women who are having orgasms with one partner will use that as a sign of quality. So to choose one high quality mate over another, and there's quite a bit of literature in the sort of evolutionary theory about mate selection, trying to find a mate that's got like all of the right properties to mate with. Part of the problem here is, so at least part of the problem is, this doesn't really account for the orgasm intercourse discrepancy. So this isn't one of the things that I sort of laid out in the basic orgasm facts, but it's very well established that intercourse is not the best way for women to have orgasms. That's not a way that they're likely to have orgasms on average. Intercourse is much, much less likely to cause a woman to have an orgasm than masturbation is, or other ways of stimulating her. So, unclear how orgasm is related to mate selection. Okay. All right. Another class of accounts, sperm competition accounts. So, okay. So this is another sort of, in some sense, mate selection account, in the sense that the idea here is that orgasm functions as a way of deciding that a certain partner was high quality, and so the high quality mate will give you an orgasm, and that orgasm will cause the sperm that they've just sort of deposited in you to be more likely to fertilize the egg. Okay, so that is this sort of sperm competition accounts rely on what's called the upsuck hypothesis. Charming, right? The upsuck hypothesis is the idea that the contractions that come with orgasm are likely to move sperm into the uterus and therefore make it more likely to fertilize the egg. So the idea here is you'll have an orgasm with a high quality partner. That high quality partner is more likely to have high quality sperm. And if you have an orgasm, it moves the sperm up into the uterus. Therefore, it's a kind of selection of what the best sperm is. So this is in some sense a female choice hypothesis. That is, that the woman is selecting which sperm she wants to fertilize her by selecting in a very broad and maybe involuntary sense, but by having an orgasm with one mate rather than another. So one problem here is that upsuck doesn't seem to be a real thing. Some very brave volunteers underwent the following procedure. So, I mean, this sperm competition account assumes or relies on the idea that having an orgasm moves more sperm up into the uterus. And these very brave volunteers had a slightly radioactive ejaculate-like substance injected into them, and then laid in a scanner and masturbated themselves to orgasm so that they could see whether the substance was sucked up into their uterus, and it wasn't. There was just no evidence that orgasm made any difference to the amount of sperm that gets taken up. So there's no evidence for upsuck. Therefore, the sperm competition account, really just the basic mechanism by which it's supposed to influence mate choice, is not there. Yeah. Okay. A whole different class of suggested theories are behavioral reinforcement accounts. Okay, so Diamond and Hurdy argue that intermittent reinforcement provided by the variability of the female orgasm means that they'll be motivated to copulate more, sort of securing for them more protection and resources. Okay, so one advantage of this account, one nice thing about it, is that it actually takes into account the variability between women on how often they have orgasms. The previous accounts were explaining it is in terms of like benefits that accrue every time you have an orgasm, but not taking into account the fact that many women, much of the time, don't have orgasms, especially during intercourse. Okay, so that's nice. They're taking some of the basic facts about orgasm into account. The problem is that this theory doesn't work on women who can't have orgasms at all. So, pardon me. So the intermittent reinforcement thing. This is a real phenomenon from understanding how people respond to rewards. And if you play video games, they've probably used this strategy on you. So if you say you're playing a slot machine, every time you pull the crank, you get 1 quarter out. Suppose it's a terrible slot machine, but like if you get a reward every time, then as soon as the rewards stop coming, you will stop playing the game. Whereas if the rewards are intermittent, that is, they come once in a long while, you will continue to look for the reward much longer than if it was happening every time and then just stopped. So intermittent reinforcement is a very effective strategy for keeping people doing a thing over and over again. So they're not pulling this out of nowhere. This is a real fact about human psychology. Orgasm is clearly very rewarding. So maybe the fact that it only happens once in a while causes women, motivates women to like do more sex. Right. So once again, this doesn't explain the like 10 to 15% of women who don't have orgasms or don't have them regularly. And it's also an odd story to tell because humans copulate way more than we need to in order to get resources and reproduce. Like we copulate sort of very regularly compared to how often we need to do it in order to just produce babies. So it's weird to suppose that we need a mechanism to get women to copulate more. And also just the sex act is typically reported as being very rewarding and reinforcing. So not clear what work that this theory is actually doing. Okay, so all right. Sorry, that was a bit of a whirlwind tour through this. I hope you do the readings and sort of look at these critiques in more detail. I haven't given you the whole story, and I haven't looked at all of them. Some of them are just so weird that you can't believe that somebody wrote them down. But let's talk a little bit about the alternative that Lloyd's presenting, because she's got her own view of this. And her alternative is that the female orgasm in humans was not specifically selected for, right? It's a byproduct. So what she's going to argue for is what's called a byproduct account. Okay, so there are lots of byproducts in our bodies, right? There are lots of things that aren't selected for, but that were brought along for the ride, let's say. So for the big example is nipples on men. My nipples don't do anything. They're not for anything as far as anyone can tell. But they, everybody gets to have nipples because when we were in the womb, so when you're early in your sort of development, men and women are not differentiated. Men and women, males and females, we all start out the same, basically. So in the womb, we all start out the same. And it's sort of several weeks in that a flush of hormones either does or doesn't send you down the path of becoming male. So nipples develop before that, and that means that men get nipples as well. So everybody gets nipples because it's super important for women to have them. And the fact that men have them too doesn't mean that they were selected for in men. It just means that they're a byproduct of this other evolutionary process. So many things get linked across the sexes, and there doesn't need to be an explanation for why men have nipples, whereas because they just came along as a byproduct of embryonic development. So her proposal for how the female orgasm works is that it's a little like that. That is, it's a kind of byproduct of other selective pressures shaping the body. And there doesn't need to be an evolutionary reason for it in the sense of it being selected for something. So what she's doing here is picking up on a fairly long tradition in evolutionary biology of critiquing what's called adaptationism. So adaptationism is one of the main biases that she identifies in this book. A kind of classic paper on adaptationism is called The Spandrels of San Marco and the Panglossian Paradigm, a critique of the adaptationist program. Well, they really titled them back in the day. Okay, so this paper is a very general one about evolutionary biology, and they think that people are just too quick. So Gould and Lewontin, you might have heard of Gould, and you've hopefully heard of Lewontin because you read some papers by him last week. You read a chapter of his book. It's the same. That's the same Lewontin. And their main point in this paper is that there's lots of stuff in evolution that's like a spandrel. So the Spandrels of San Marco. San Marco is a church. It's got all these lovely arches. And the architects built it with arches because arches are sort of stable structures. They can hold up the roof of the church very well. So there's a good architectural reason why the arches are there. Now, the spandrel is the little gap between arches. And what they imagine is that somebody walks into the Church of San Marco and says, wow, look at those spandrels. They're so beautifully decorated. How clever of the architect to have put them in there. So they decorate the spandrels all nice. And somebody might think that those were an intentional design feature. But the spandrels are actually just there because that's what happens when you put a bunch of arches together close up. And the arches are there to hold up the ceiling. So the arches are what there's a reason for. The spandrels just kind of come along as a byproduct of other design features. So they think that Gould and Lewontin argue in 1979 that people are running around attributing design to lots of things in the human body and in other animals without really going through the steps. That is, without really showing that it was selected for, rather than just something that comes about. Okay. And since Lloyd's book has been published, the book was published in 2005, I believe, and in 2016, there's been a little bit of progress on this question of the evolution of the orgasm in human women. So Mihaela and Wagner, 2016, argue that the female orgasm used to have a function, and then it lost that function. And in losing that function, it became like a spandrel. But then it became available for selection for other reasons. So it's an interesting hypothesis. So they look at the way that they go through this is they look at a bunch of mammals, not quite as related to us as chimps and bonobos, but for example, rabbits and I think llamas. So in rabbits, there's a very different setup than what we've got. What we've got is, what rabbits have is a clitoris inside the vaginal canal, and they don't ovulate unless they've had an orgasm. So they don't release an egg unless they've had the orgasm, which is a signal that they've had sex. So the orgasm has just in female rabbits as clear an evolutionary function as the male orgasm does, which is to release the gamete, release either the sperm or the egg. Okay, so they've traced back a bunch of different. So there's some species in which the orgasm has this role as a signal to ovulate, and then there's a bunch of other organisms like us where the egg just sort of automatically gets released. There's no signal that needs to be received in order to release the egg. It just happens on a monthly basis. And what they do is go back about 30 million years to find around the point at which we probably lost that sort of orgasm as ovulation signal, and it became sort of an automatic ovulation became an automatic process. So is it Lloyd's account or isn't it? It's in some sense Lloyd's account. It's this is saying that so Lloyd says it's a byproduct. In this paper, Mihaela and Wagner, they argue that it's used to have a function and it lost that function. Now, they leave open the possibility that it has acquired new functions. So it could be that one or more of the stories that I just told you could be rehabilitated or changed, or a different story could be told to sort of explain why the orgasm has adaptive value for humans, but they don't sort of like nail it down to it's got to be this one. But I thought this was an interesting development in this story, and in some sense I do think it vindicates Lloyd's suggestion that what we're looking at is less a specific target of selection and more something that's got ambiguous, at least selective pressures acting on it. Okay, so that was one of the major biases that she identifies. The other one was androcentrism. And androcentrism is just a term for assuming men as the normal case. So taking men to be the sort of standard and then maybe fitting in women as an afterthought. This is pretty common in, for example, clinical trials. So loads and loads of clinical trials are done just on men. I think people are getting slightly better about this because there's been quite a bit of like concern about it. But we can also see it more specifically in, for example, Desmond Morris's claim. So if you recall, Desmond Morris said maybe the female orgasm causes women to lay still and therefore are more likely to get pregnant. And that's just directly sort of like taking the male experience and just projecting it directly onto women without actually knowing what women are experiencing, or at least on average what women are experiencing. So androcentrism seems to play a role, assuming men are the normal case, seems to play a role in several of the accounts. That's the Desmond Morris one is the most prominent one, but there's a few more. Okay, so just to bring this back and sort of to try to articulate the point of all this, bring this back to the discussion that we had last week about ideology. So I think androcentrism and perhaps adaptationism both in this case function as a kind of unknown known. That is, when Desmond Morris is thinking about, I'm trying to figure out what the female orgasm is about, he didn't intentionally say, I'm going to take my male-centered experience and project it onto women. He just knew that orgasms make you sleepy. That's something that he knew, but he didn't know that he knew it, if you catch my meaning. So this is an instance of ideology functioning in evolutionary theory, and it's hopefully an argument in general for thinking hard about the values and perspectives that we bring to bear on the world, and recognizing that they're probably partial, they are probably biased, and that you'd be better off getting somebody who's had different life experiences from you weighing in on the subject, because you can help sort of like dig out these biases. And as Lloyd is pursuing this project, she's clearly not saying, let's give up on the theory of evolution or let's give up on evolutionary biology. She's trying to show that paying attention to, being sensitive to the kind of biases that you bring to bear on any subject, digging up those biases can help us do better science.